Good afternoon, students. This is round 2 of me recording. I tried recording yesterday whilst you were all inside the seminar room, but I spoke forever and nothing happened. So the file was corrupted. So I'll start again. So hopefully you get this before you do your study later on today. What I'm going to do is actually go through the poem and explain some of the things that people either missed or people picked up on, okay? But what you will need access to is the poem, which is here. You might also want to access this website here, which is just called Dorothy Hewitt Context and Complexity. Also things that you'll be covering today is Sample A and Sample B, close readings. These readings scored 20 plus each. So great little examples to have a look at. But what we're going to do is first look at the poem. So if you can bring up the poem, I've got it here, okay? So as we sort of discussed last week with regard to the close reading section, before you've even gone into the assessment, you know something, okay? So what we've got to do is engage our prior knowledge. Now, in this case, we've looked at poems before by Dorothy Hewitt, and you'll probably continue to look at poems by Dorothy Hewitt in the future. I'm not saying that's necessarily going to be in the exam, but you know, she's a prolific West Australian poet. So what you need to be doing is making sure you're exploring some contextual factors and building some knowledge about prolific authors and poets that you may come across. And often you will come across Australian poets. So a simple Wikipedia search of Dorothy Hewitt will reveal to you that she's a prolific feminist, writer, poet, playwright. She was also a member of the Australian Communist Party in the 50s. Grew up in the wheat belt, but did move to the city where she lectured at UWA in education. So even just those little bits of knowledge will help alter your interpretation and reading of the text. Other things we know is in Midland where the trains go by. So linking this to the context of production, 1959, you're probably aware that Midland was a bustling industrial site where the trains would come and go, not passenger trains necessarily like you're expecting of Trans-Perth, but more so industrial trains carting cargo to and from. So before we've even gone into this poem, we're thinking about those factors, okay? Now, if you look to this site here, and I do recommend reading this article if you're interested in, you'll see that Dorothy Hewitt is quite a complex individual, and she's quite controversial in some of her thoughts and ideas that she expressed, but it will give you a really good insight into, I suppose, her feminist perspective and how she came about having the views and opinions that she did. There is some language warning in here, but we are all old enough to sort of navigate that ourselves. So if we head back to the poem then, with this knowledge of her as a feminist author, grew up in the wheat belt, came back to Midland as a lively, bustling community, but albeit a working class, factory-based one, we then can go in to read our poem and kind of make sense of the poem. Now, as you're reading a poem, the first thing we're trying to look for is some kind of pattern, okay, or some kind of look to the poem. Now you can see here most of these are made of 5 stanzas, with each stanza having 6 lines for the most part, with the exception of this one here. You'll notice it's got a rhyming structure of A, A, B, B, C, C, again with the exception of this one here. Okay, and many of you picked up on the idea that it did create a sense of uniformity, almost like the sound that would come about of a train rolling in. So in Midland still the train goes by, the black smoke thunders on the sky, still in the grass the lovers lie, a cheek on cheek and sigh on sigh, the dream and weep as you and I in Midland where the train goes by. So every end rhyme here, not A B C D E, A B B C C. So every line end rhyme for all 6 lines here. So we've got this contrast and this creation of a setting that is quite reminiscent of Victorian England or in a very industrialised town with the black smoke thundering. So there's a sense of foreboding and foreshadowing here that something is not quite right. We've got that connotation with thunders as something dangerous or malevolent, but yet here we've got these lovers sitting there lying in the grass, cheek to cheek, but also sigh on sigh. So we've got this dichotomy here between a sense of happiness and joy, but also a sense of unknown and exasperation. They dream and weep. Again, we've got this binary contrast here, dreaming but weeping at the same time in Midland where the train goes by. So these lovers, we're not quite sure if they're happy to be in this setting or not. Do they see a future in this industrial town? What is their role within this town is being questioned here because they're dreaming but weeping at the same time. Across the bridge, across the town, the workers hurry up and down. The pub still stands, the publican is still a gross, corrupted man, and bottles clinking in the park make symphonies of summer dark. So here we're introduced to this idea of the very routine life that one occupies within this town, with the workers hurrying up and down. Oh, I just rhymed. Where the workers hurrying up and down. So we've got this introduction of a class reading and a Marxist reading, which many of you picked up on, particularly when many of you reference the publican as somewhat of a corrupt ruler or elite class here, the bourgeoisie, who is taking the money and really, I suppose, disrespecting the rights and the, I suppose, needs of the lower classes. So many of you picked up on this idea. But there's also this beauty here, the bottles clinking in the park, making symphonies of summer dark. So you kind of got to question, are the working class happy here? Because for me, there's quite a beautiful cacophony here of sound. Despite it perhaps being a harsh sound of the bottles clinking, for me, there's an association with fun, with laughter. And maybe that's an association because I am, from a working class family. So just something to consider, that obviously our own context is shaping meaning. Across the bridge the stars go down, our two ghosts meet across the town. Who dared so much must surely creep between young lovers' lips, asleep. Who dared so much must surely live in train smoke off the Midland Bridge. Okay, so here's where some people started to allude to the Gothic conventions and the Gothic elements within this text. So we've got this idea of isolation and the working class v the upper class, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. And then you've got this idea of the two ghosts who dared so much as much surely creep. Why are they creeping? Is a love that's not supposed to be? They're not supposed to, are they of different classes? Or what is it? Why are they creeping around in this train smoke off the Midland Bridge? But again, we've got this idea that the bridge is still, the Midland and the train is ever present and the smoke is ever present. Some of you explored the idea that the train represents capitalism and that capitalism stops for no one, and that it's such a choking and suffocating ideal and ideology that it can lead to perhaps the death of the working class or any sense of vibrancy and youth. And then we can start to think, between the young lovers' lips asleep, are they already dead? Or is it just, I suppose, a hyperbolic statement? In Midland, in the railway yards, they shuffle time like packs of cards, and kings and queens and jacks go down, but we come up in Midland town. So many people clung onto the idea that this idea of revolt, which we can sort of see in a Marxist reading here, where the working class are rising up against the likes of the kings and queens and jacks, who act perhaps as a symbolic representation of the upper class or the elite. Oh, factory girls in cotton slips and men with grease across your lips. Okay, let kings and queens and jacks go down, but still we'll kiss in Midland town. Now, this is where I thought the poem becomes a bit more triumphant in tone. It's kind of like a call to action to the working class. Let kings and queens and jacks go down, but still we'll kiss in Midland town. Our youthful energy will prevail in Midland town. So despite the grease across your lips from working a menial, endless, mind-numbingly boring job, we'll still be able to have those acts of frivolity and passion, which we associate with the young, but also we associate with the working class, because they're the same working class who are clinking bottles in the park. An oath, a whisper, and a laugh will make a better epitaph. We'll share a noggin in the park and whistle songs against the dark. There is no death that we can die in Midland where the train goes by. So again, kind of creates that sense of triumph and revolution that you can't control us. So in Midland, the capitalist train will still prevail and it will still go by, but we will, ensure that we whistle, as a form of protest, kind of like the zippity-doo-dah in the Book of Everything, against the dark, and the dark being that thunderous black smoke that is capitalism and the bourgeoisie. We will prevail against them. And if you think about Dorothy Hewitt as someone who was a prolific feminist, but also a communist. She is someone that's going to be going and fighting for the proletariat to ensure the steady demise of the bourgeoisie. However, we also kind of, if you look into the history of Dorothy Hewitt, she was someone that became disheartened and disassociated with the Communist Party because they were the same people who often make a big scene or may have a big voice against the elite and the ruling class. However, when it came time to actually act, there was very, very little that could be done. And it's almost, you sort of see that in here throughout this text, is that whilst there's a willingness and there's that activism there's still an unease and a preoccupation with just surviving that doesn't allow for radical change. Is she critiquing that idea? Perhaps. I'm not sure. But it can be read into this text that I suppose the preoccupation of the working class isn't necessarily about overcoming the situation, the dire situation that they're in, and that sometimes it's just about survival. Because at the end of the day, one must go to work, one must, get the grease across your lips, and in time we will have those parties and the frivolity of the bottles clinking and the symphonies of Summer Dark. And she was dissatisfied with the Communist Party as being a party that didn't take action, despite, advocating strongly and loudly for change. Now, this is just one interpretation. Again, you can make your own reading of the text, but what I'd recommend you do is see how two different students have done that. Okay, one student took produced a Gothic reading of the text, and I can show you that one here, and the other produced a class reading of the text. So both are wonderful examples of how we can approach the text completely differently. Now, I, being a working class student of political science, definitely read the text as a comment on Marxism and class reading. However, I could read into the romantic genre as well as the Gothic elements, particularly as it relates to the supernatural elements within the text, but also the theme of isolation. However, the other student in sample A presented a more class reading, kind of like what we did here. And you can sort of see by looking at these examples what your peers are doing and how they're embedding evidence and those sorts of things. So I really would recommend looking at that, and I'd also recommend looking at the past waste paper and thinking about how you could apply maybe the features of the Gothic genre or romantic movement, feminism, class readings to some of those texts that we've studied previously. So I'm going to post this video now, and I'm going to create another video about the close reading skills and things to consider based on feedback from previous close readings that we've done.